There is a lot of cut content in both Dark Souls and Bloodborne, just like in any other game. An aspect gets created and it gets lost on the cut and room floor. To decipher each game from one another, not only do the games need to tell a new story, but they also need to add onto the existing mechanics of the previous game. Take life gems in Dark Souls 2 for example, a relatively simple mechanic but fundamentally changed the way you play the game. But today we're going to go over some gameplay mechanics, ideas and concepts that were almost finished but never made it into the final version of the games. We'll be looking at all the Dark Souls games and Bloodborne, so sit back, relax, and discover how our beloved franchise could have been different. When developing Dark Souls 1, our trusty FireKeepers weren't even a thing, they didn't exist. The original plan was to have our favourite fairy dragon, yes you guessed it, Priscilla, act in a similar way to the Maiden in Black from Demon's Souls and the Emerald Herald in Dark Souls 2. When you think about it, it's a small change that could have had a huge significance on the lore and perhaps changed Priscilla's story completely. Instead of leveling at the bonfires, we would just go straight to her. Now the leveling system was most likely changed due to how complex and intertwined the world of Dark Souls 1 is, and having a character you level up at only really works from a gameplay perspective where you can easily travel to and from them. A thing I'd also like to note is the painted world of Ariamis was a test level in Dark Souls 1. So it was the first actual level From Software created for the game, and you can kind of tell. The amount of detail crammed into this small zone really stands out from the rest of the game, and with how the layout of that area was, having an NPC you level up at made sense if all your zones in the game acted in a similar fashion. I think having Priscilla be a main heroine would have been pretty cool, but in hindsight with the way the game is now, I could see why it would not work from a gameplay perspective. The torch in Dark Souls 2. Now, Paragon, I hear you cry, we have a torch in Dark Souls 2. Well yes, but originally the torch was to play a major part in progressing through certain areas. The game's visuals were supposed to be a hell of a lot darker, forcing the player to get out their torch so they could carry on with their journey. As cool as this sounds, forcing the player to give up their offhand item and replace it with a torch might have just play tested poorly. Although adding to the overall aesthetic to the world, I can see why this change was made. The torch mechanic made a giant change in the overall visuals of Dark Souls 2 in the end, and I'll bet the reason we have such a different visual style in the final version of Dark Souls 2 compared to its earlier trailers is because of the torch. I'm really curious actually, how do you think you'd feel about being forced to give up your offhand item to be able to see? The only instance I can think of at the top of my head where a player is semi-forced to change their equipment is the Yarn battle. But I feel the ability to not see where you're going without the torch could have upset a lot of players. Now Bloodborne is my favourite game of all time, just thought I'd throw that out there. When the initial trailer Project Beast got leaked, it revealed a bunch of stuff we would not have access to later in the main game. I'm going to just spur a couple of them off right now, so... First things first, there was a kick. Acted exactly how it did in Dark Souls 1, got removed in Dark Souls 2. Why it was removed, I don't really know, but it's pretty cool to see it in action. Next we had a mechanic called Tower Gathering. The way it would work would be a bell would ring out and enemies in that area would go and gather around that bell. The bell would have an RNG aspect to it, so in your playthrough, if the bell didn't toll, they would just have their usual pathing and placement, but if it did ring out, then enemies would start venturing over to that sound. Almost similar to how the wolves in the Ashes of Ariandel DLC work, when one howls, they all come a running. This reminds me of one of the very first areas in the game, around the big bonfire. A large number of enemies gathering at one location. It would have been pretty cool to have the RNG aspect in the game, but again, with how the final game turned out, I don't see many locations where this mechanic would be deemed usable. Lastly, for Bloodborne, the original lamps weren't a thing. The whole checkpoint system was there, but instead of flicking your fingers and lighting the lamp, you would just thrust a sword into the ground, and then this would act as your bonfire/lamp. Kind of similar to how the Sacrificial Ceremonies work in Dark Souls 3, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. This system was probably changed as thrusting your sword into the ground resembled the coil sword from Dark Souls a bit too much. The heat up mechanic is a system in Dark Souls 3 that's kind of already there. To put it bluntly, it's basically boss phases. Bosses change what they do, attack patterns, movements, etc. as the fight progresses. What was interesting about the heat up mechanic is that it was speculated to change boss encounters judging on what you've done in the world. Kind of similar to how the world tendency systems acted in Demon's Souls. Let's say for example you didn't free a certain NPC, then a boss would have a different encounter than normal, performing different moves, be more aggressive, stuff like that. Kind of similar to if you've completed Secret's questline. The arm fight will be slightly different in regards to you have unwarranted help in the form of the Onion Knight. And another example, in Dark Souls 2, if you're wearing Velstat's armor in the Fume Knight fight, he will skip straight to his powered up stance. So depending on what you're doing in the world, some bosses would react differently. I actually love this idea. I could see it being used on a lot of bosses. For instance, if we were wearing some of the Prince's gear and we go fight a Seros, he'll just skip straight to his crazy phase. Adding things like this in the game is just cool, simple as that, and I wish we had more of it. Even if it's not a drastic change, watching bosses react to you because of a thing you've done outside of the boss arena would have been a welcomed addition. The Sacrificial Ceremonies were going to be a pivotal part of online play in Dark Souls 3. The idea was you'd haul around a dead body, sacrificing movement speed and your offhand, similar to the torch topic we discussed earlier, and then sacrificed it, creating a makeshift bonfire, a mobile checkpoint if you were to call it that. And then this would allow you to summon in phantoms as well. So if you wanted to co-op, you'd have to perform the ceremony. So instead of simply summoning people, you'd have to perform this act. Now I'm not sure if you could summon 2 people normally like we do now, and then to summon the third you'd have to perform the ceremony, which would probably make more sense with how the game works now. The downside of this would be, when you did perform the ceremony, your world would be open to more invaders. Now aspects of this did make it into the final game, with invasions prioritizing co-opers, especially those who have popped the dried finger. I think this mechanic, although it sounds cool, the way the levels are designed in Dark Souls 3, we really didn't need any more bonfires. This system might have been the most unique aspect of a Soulsborne game we've ever seen. It's a shame it wasn't kept in. Even if it wasn't a makeshift bonfire, it would have been pretty cool to do this to open up more online play, rather than this. And that's pretty much it for this video. There's a bunch of other ideas that didn't make it into the final version of the Soulsborne game, so if you've got one that you like and wasn't talked about here, let me know. Also, I just want to thank my patrons for sticking with me for another month. You guys are beautiful, and I want to thank everyone that came to the 20k subscriber celebration stream. We reached over 100 viewers on my Twitch, which felt bloody amazing, so yeah, thank you guys so much for that. With that said guys, take care everyone, be good to one another, and thanks for watching.